So welcome everyone. Very nice to have you all here. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher. I will just say a few words about us in case you're joining us for the first time. So what we normally do is introducing Jewish life around the world, Jewish history, heritage, culture, and we normally focus on different cities or countries' Jewish heritage, but we also have another series, which is what today's talk belongs to, which is the Qesher Book Club. And in this series, we introduce Jewish themed books that we felt like that they somehow connect to our overall theme of learning about Jewish life around the world. So we are very happy to welcome today Elizabeth Schwartz, who is going to share with us about her book. She's the vocalist for Yale Strom and Hot Pastrami, and she has also performed as a soloist at festivals, synagogues, and concert halls on every continent except for Antarctica. So if anyone knows how to get a gig in Antarctica, please let her know. As a writer, she co-created the award-winning audio dramas, The Witches of Lublin and Debs in Canton. She contributed a chapter on klezmer vocal technique to Spiel, The Art of Playing Klezmer, and her recipes of Jewish food can be found in several publications as well. Today, she will introduce her book, The Sweet Fragrance of Life and Other Horror Stories. So I'm going to pass the word to Elizabeth, and she will introduce us to this wonderful book.
Thank you, Dora. Shalom Aleichem Eich. Yes, it's listening to my bio. It sounds like I do a lot, but I really do one thing in many different media, which is I dive into this historical Ashkenazic and beyond, but Jewish culture, and particularly from my point of view as a woman, but the singing really came first. That was sort of the entry point for my research. And as a woman, as a feminist, and as someone who was raised in a very secular, humanistic way, but profoundly Jewish, I have a very worldly approach, as I'm sure everyone here does, to this experience of being a Jew throughout history, not just today and not just in biblical times. So these stories really came out of a certain period of time, which I'll talk about. But let me just say that everything started with my experience as a singer dealing with these prohibitions on my voice, which I'd never experienced until it became the Jewish music world. And but then, of course, as a woman, it's not just a musical prohibition on using your voice or your agency. So I really have had myriad experiences as a vocalist with this ban on a woman's voice, the Kol Isha. And this is one of the prohibitions that seems easier for observant Jews to grasp, so it's regularly adopted. Touring through the Alsace-Lorraine region, for example, I regularly had to deal with things that felt outside of my prescribed duties, which was to stand there and tell these musical stories. Concerts would be moved from sacred spaces to social halls, even in the liberal or what we think of as reform context. But then there might be a hushed and frantic conversation even there, and a microphone would have to be provided so that my amplified and therefore distorted voice might then be acceptable. And this has actually happened more than once with such terrible sound equipment that my voice actually would be distorted. But I've been performing for many years, and while I obviously have personal feelings about this entire situation, it no longer shocks me or even angers me. I'm just accustomed to this practice. So much so that we were in Jerusalem and giving a concert in a very Haredi Orthodox environment. And I was actually shocked because not only did I find myself on stage with actual Haredi musicians in the long capotes, but they actually stayed on stage with me and played with me as I sang. So in some ways that made me even more aware of how arbitrary and I don't want to say bullshit, I'll be polite and just say narish, foolish this prohibition is. So that made me start thinking, where did this prohibition come from? And I went to Chabad.org and read, this is the quote: the singing voice of a woman is considered sensual and possibly stimulating to males. It is therefore forbidden for a man to hear a woman other than his immediate family sing, and it is prohibited to pray or study Torah in that environment. Several halachic, Jewish law, several halakhic authorities are of the opinion that a recording or a radio transmitted singing voice of a woman who one does not personally know would not actually be prohibited. It is the custom, however, in most Orthodox circles for men to refrain from hearing a woman sing in any format through any medium. I know that in today's time, this might seem severe. This is still quoting. But the Torah puts such enormous value on the bond between a husband and wife that it does not allow for any potential damage to a man's undivided and unequivocal devotion and attraction to his one and only partner in life. Still quoting, imagine how beautiful that is. I just want to mention that this really positive and reasonable explanation for silencing a woman was written by a woman, because we who are affected by the rules often learn to internalize them, learn to modify our statements with question marks and vocal fry and all of these other things that make, even in non-religious, non-musical contexts, just in a board meeting, make us seem less offensive. We say, I think that, instead of this is how it is, or we end our questions with a question mark so as to be less unlikable. So we have learned that the origin of this prohibition is in the Torah, except, is it really? King Solomon wrote some very sexy poetry in the Song of Songs to Sheba, specifically, let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet. Contrast that to the 3rd century Babylonian sage Shmuel, who said a woman's voice is indecent. Now, I believe, no, I'm not going to say I believe, this is the origin of Kol Isha. Now, he confused the Hebrew word for sweet, arav, with the similar sounding Hebrew word for indecent, erva. And although spelled differently, they sound alike. And thus Shmuel, using the methodology of Midrash, read the verse as though Solomon was saying to Sheba, let me hear your voice, for your voice is indecent. In other words, sexually stimulating. But the Song of Songs is about love. It is about praising beauty. But look how just one man in the 3rd century changed the entire interpretation. Something that had been beautiful was now something dangerous that had to be contained. Because if a man is being driven to distraction by the sound of a woman's voice, he's not in control of himself, but more correctly, he's not in control of her. In the Talmud, his statement was not presented as law, nor did it appear in the earlier laws of the Mishnah. It's one opinion that has caused problems for millennia. Certainly not just for me. Had this really been an ancient law, how could Miriam have been singing by the Red Sea? So right then and there, we have a problem, but why was it so readily adopted, this interpretation? So let's look around the world at the non-Jewish places where this is prevalent. I read a wonderful essay in Bustle magazine that was like an overview. So I'm going to quote liberally from it when I say, here's a great myth surrounding a woman's voice. The idea of women's voices as inherently dangerous is actually ancient. The most prominent example, of course, is the sirens of Greek myth, who lure men to their island with their hypnotic song and then either kill them or leave them to drown on the rocks. During the medieval period, the idea of women's voices being dangerous became a legal issue. Women accused of witchcraft were often charged with verbally cursing other people or their livestock, doing things like saying the Pater Noster backwards. This is a medieval Christian interpretation. In the Bible, Paul's letter to the Corinthians includes an injunction that women are in no way allowed to speak in church. And if they have questions, they should wait until afterward. In all the churches of the sanctified, let women keep silent, for it is not entrusted to them to speak aloud, but let them be kept in line. This is the quote, let them be kept in line as the law states. If they want to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to talk aloud in church. This actually continues to be debated as part of effective practice in Christian churches. And the idea of whether women can actually preach effectively or give readings is still a contentious issue, particularly in the Catholic tradition. But just last year, the Southern Baptist Convention ruled against women pastors. So this is an ongoing question. What is so objectionable about women opening their mouths? Let me get back to medieval thought and that Bustle article. A lot of medieval Christian beliefs about women's speech were rooted in the idea that it was women talking that got everybody into trouble in the first place, by advising Adam to eat the apple in the Garden of Eden while under the sway of the devil. Quote, women's voices were perceived as representative of the sins which the mouth could effuse, major sins such as scolding and illicit speech, as well as the minor sins, such as the major ones, such as heresy itself, were perceived as coming more often than not from a woman's mouth. This is my favorite crazy 12th century religious thought. Old women were innately more wicked, usually because they weren't menstruating any longer, side note, and therefore no longer of any value, and were the devil's mouth, just as preachers are God's mouth. A French medieval tale takes this to a full extreme. It alleges that the devil, when completing the creation of women, farted on her tongue, meaning that all women's speech is literally farts from hell. So, Shmuel seems a little less crazy now. Still not good, but at least he has a community. Old Russian folktales talk about the belief in rusalki, ghosts of stillborn girls or drowned women living underwater, who would attract people to them with their beauty and singing in remote forests and lakes, and then either drown them or tickle them to death. Well, that's a variation on the Greek siren myth. Props for the tickling. Rusalki were in some regions meant to have been boiled by the devil, which accounted for their prodigious verbal charms. I don't want to leave Celtic myth out of this conversation. Let's talk for a moment about the banshee and her wail, because the banshee is always a woman, always dangerous, and if you hear her, you or someone in your family will die. Historians have traced the first written accounts of banshees to 8th century poems based on a tradition where women sang a sorrowful song to lament someone's death. So why exactly would that be subsequently interpreted as dangerous or fatal? There is a similarity here to an early ancient Greek practice. Women specifically sang at funerals, whether as family members or hired for this purpose. The funeral songs they sang, and more astonishingly, were a function for which they were themselves honored. These songs were essential to completing the burial service. They would sing and loudly lament in funerary processions that accompanied the body to the grave and were considered a hugely important part of the proceedings. It's a belief that has its own manifestation in traditional Chinese culture as well, where the women of the house, including daughters and daughters-in-law, are expected to sing specific songs to help a spirit after it passes away. A pavilion song, excuse me, to help the spirit relax on its way, and an open door song to direct it to the correct parts of the netherworld, etc. Interestingly, the Greek ritual of women singing evolved over time into something else. This is important. Laws passed in Greece. Oh, the funerary oration became something that was given by men. Why? Laws passed in Greece from the 6th century BCE onwards were actually meant to restrict women's mourning because they were likely becoming too powerful in their control of funerals. Female singing was seen as so powerful, it was threatening. And because it was a professional practice, therefore a compensated practice. Women with money were resented, like after World War II, when American soldiers wanted their jobs back. Women cannot be providers because money is power, is independence. And that's a threat, but to whom? This article, by the way, was written during the Trump-Clinton debates, so which should surprise exactly no one. And I think it was written because so many of the response to the debates was that because Hillary Clinton, by stating facts, by not being timid or apologetic, was described more often than not with one adjective: unlikable. So this speaking with authority, speaking with power, and speaking with knowledge is still in many degrees considered unacceptable. This global and cultural religious history and my personal experiences negotiating my way through them. And let me just say parenthetically, before I became a professional Yiddish singer, I did serve my time in a prior career as a woman executive. And believe me, there was nothing particularly artistic, certainly not musical in those contexts, but very much I was still dealing in another context with this kind of scenario. Speak up, but don't speak up too much. Say something of value, but don't, not more valuable than what other people, meaning men, are saying in the room. So this is something far beyond this talk, my experience. This is really something that has had a global historical context to it that's still always been percolating in my brain. So I think all of these kind of led to my looking for a book like The Sweet Fragrance of Life. I love fantasy, horror a little less so, but I'm willing to read it if it's not particularly graphic. And I and certainly about this kind of whole shtetl existence, and I couldn't find it. And frankly, that's kind of what I think propelled me to write this book. And I do call the genre feminist shtetl horror, and I do think that I'm not the only one who finds that redundant. Each of the stories that I wrote in this book, and here's the book, each of the stories that I wrote in this book are grounded in real history and culture, particularly the political and social norms. I was also profoundly affected just stylistically as a child by Angela Carter. If you know her wonderful oeuvre of, or her book, The Company of Wolves, I think was one of her most celebrated works, but where she takes these fairy tale stories that we know so well and sort of turn them on their heads and examine them entirely differently from a female point of view. So this wasn't the first time I examined this shtetl culture from what a woman's experience might have been like through a contemporary lens. As Dora mentioned, I did write an audio drama with Yael Stroh, my husband, and with a wonderful friend of ours, the writer Ellen Kushner. We wrote this audio drama called The Witches of Lublin, which examines many of the same of these things. That was a bit more magical realism, but definitely kind of looked at these social norms through what it must have been to be a woman with a powerful voice who was constantly constrained from using it. And by the way, that audio drama production company is currently producing the illustrated audiobook of The Sweet Fragrance of Life. So that'll be out in October. And that's in English and in Yiddish, and we'll have music and lots of other things. So anyway, let me mention that now let me talk about this book a little bit specifically. So an author's voice, unlike a woman's physical voice, is not subject to the imposition of control and containment. It's just a question of whether anybody will ever be able to read it. It grants me, in this case, the freedom to explore all the facets of everything I've been talking about today. So the first story in this book, the Rebbe's Prayer is Answered, is set in 18th century Poland and deliberately told through the man's point of view. You don't hear from any of the female characters. It's really, the way I wanted to start the book was as a man who sees the women around him only in the context of himself. And the women in this book are seen very strictly through his very depersonalizing gaze. But I was equally interested in mining how he was perceived by his community while he was doing this, and how he could be one person to them and an entirely different person to me. I think, in all honesty, I wanted to manipulate the concept of God in a way that God has been engineered by, let's face it, men as a tool used against women. I'll read a little bit from that in a little bit. But in the second story, The Sweet Fragrance of Life, I set that during the interwar period. And I set it in Marburg, Germany, which is a little Easter egg because that's where the Brothers Grimm went to university, and that was historically considered by them to be their favorite place in Germany. So I thought, oh, let me get into Marburg, where I have been a few times. The protagonist here is a German Jewish girl in the interwar period who fails, or perhaps doesn't want to recognize what is happening all around her. And which I think also certainly has relevance to our world today. But I also wanted to dive a little bit into how that could be, how people could not really see this bigger picture of what's happening in the broader society, while they're locked into the minutia of their own daily lives. The title of the story comes from an orchestral song cycle for two voices by Gustav Mahler, who wrote it in contemplation of death. In the story, it is sung by the central character and the object of her desire, and it was a deliberate choice to have her adore Mahler, a Jew who converted to Catholicism and married an avowed and passionate anti-Semite. I was interested in exploring all the factors that might make a young woman conspire against her own best interests, not unlike the author of that Chabad article, rationally explaining why her own voice was indecent. I referenced the character's singing voice and its poor quality and her awareness of this. My final story, The Jonah, is my family is from Romania. And this is the one that is set against an actual specific historical event, which was the sinking of the Struma. By the way, I do connect my Romanian heritage to my own voice because my father had a beautiful baritone, and it was his family that was Romanian. And as a singer, I favor the Romanian Yiddish dialect for this reason. In this story, the main character is a young Jewish girl and is completely silent. And I made a very deliberate thematic connection to The Little Mermaid. Remember how we were talking about the sirens in Greek and Russian mythology, these dangerous women? So in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, the Little Mermaid gives up her voice for love, even her life, when she has the chance to get it all back. It's darker than the Disney version. In the Andersen tale, she gives up her voice, dies anyway, in the hope that in 300 years, she can look forward to redemption and her soul going up to heaven. This is some really hostile viewpoints against this character. But again, we were so accustomed to it in the very sanitized, happy version of it that we don't really think about this. But the one thing they keep in common is that her only path to happiness is to give up her voice. Again, you have to see the social and political connection to that. Her repression builds to the point that it becomes externalized. It seems to her that it is her anger that is her greatest threat to her. Once she embraces this, she becomes retribution itself. I'm talking about my character, not the Little Mermaid now. Andersen took the mermaid of ancient Greek origin and made her likable by removing the only thing that made her strong. So let me mention, I had mentioned the Struma, and I just want to go back a second for those who don't know about this, and apologies to those who do. The Struma was a Bulgarian ship that was commissioned by Romanian Jews in 1941 to take them to Turkey, from whence they planned to emigrate to British Mandate Palestine. But the British authorities wouldn't grant them entry. And then the Turkish authorities didn't want them to settle in Turkey. So the boat was towed back out into international waters and subsequently torpedoed by a Russian submarine. Obviously, my story is a completely fantastical reimagining this tragedy. All of these things, all of these factors, my deep exploration into Jewish history and culture, my immersion into Yiddishkeit as a musician, and the restrictions I've experienced in the religious milieu were the grist for my fiction. In 2012, I'm going to end with this. I was invited specifically to break the ban of Koli Shah at the Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York City. This is a synagogue that has been in continual use as a synagogue since 1887, and it has become an important cultural venue on New York's Lower East Side. So it was a big deal to officially invite a woman to sing, and it was a very big deal to be that woman asked to do it. I'm going to leave you with this before I turn to the book. What I remember most about that concert was looking out into the audience and seeing an elderly woman. And as I sang, she went like this to me. She scowled and she went, "Even happy endings have to have an asterisk." So with that, I'm going to turn to the book and I'll just read you a couple of sample chapters. I'm going to read to you from the first story. We'll see how much time we have. This is about the Rebbe's prayer is answered. And I'll set it up by saying that the Rebbe is a man in his 40s who was unable to have children with his wife and is realizing now that time is passing and he's had no opportunity to build a rabbinic dynasty. And he meets a merchant and his beautiful 15-year-old daughter, Chaya, and an idea takes root in his head that with a different wife, everything possible would be open to him, including being married into this wealthy merchant's family, the merchant being his own age, of course, but what that could mean for the community, for the construction of a beautiful new synagogue. And as we say, these thoughts bedevil him. It was the Sabbath night, and the house was quiet. The dinner guests had left, the kitchen had been cleaned and prepared for the next day, and the exhausted Rebbitzin, Gittel, barely made a lump under the quilt as she muttered and frowned in her sleep. Slowly, carefully, the Rebbe got out of bed, taking care not to awaken his wife. Gingerly, he felt his way downstairs to the kitchen. He found a candle and involuntarily winced when, for the first time in his 40 years, he struck a match on the Sabbath. But he needed light to see what he was doing. A part of the Rebbe remained detached from the devilry afoot, almost as if he himself were not doing it. As he proceeded with his plan, he wondered whether God would answer his prayer. In the larder, he found the pot of fat that Gittel preserved from each goose, hen, and duck, the schmaltz that rendered her latkes delectable. The Rebbe took the pot of schmaltz, and by the light of the candle, he carefully descended halfway down the stone steps to the root cellar. He then began systematically coating each step with the schmaltz, moving upwards as he applied the grease as thoroughly as Gittel might clean it. Satisfied with his labor, he returned the schmaltz to its rightful place and disposed of the candle so as to hide the evidence of his transgression of the Sabbath. He stealthily returned to their marital bed, taking care not to rouse his wife until he was under the covers. Then he began to toss and moan. "Oi, the hunger, my stomach," he groaned, until Gittel sat up next to him. "Husband, what is wrong?" "Why, Gittel, I'm starving." Gittel frowned. "But dinner was only a few hours ago. Surely if you go back to sleep in a few hours, it will be morning, and then I will prepare your breakfast." "No, Gittel, I must have a pickle." Then he added, shamefaced, "And I ate them all at dinner. Now we have none, and that is the only thing that can satisfy me. I tell you, I cannot get through the night without a pickle." Gittel frowned again. "Husband, you know I can't light the candle to go down to the root cellar. Surely for one day." And the Rebbe lay back rigidly. almost as if his body was locked in spasm. I tell you, Gittel, I am desperate. If I don't get a pickle right now, I will be unable to sleep, and then I will be unable to lead services in the morning. No, there's nothing for it. I must have a pickle, and I must have it now, I beg of you. Gittel searched her husband's face, but his eyes were clenched shut. As he knew she would, she rose from their bed without complaint, donned her shawl, and headed downstairs. As he heard her light steps descend, he sent up a silent and momentary prayer of thanks to the Almighty for sending him this plan that was working so well. Then he got up to follow her. To the Rebbe's consternation, Gittel had managed to navigate down the slick steps in total darkness and complete safety and was making her way back up, a jar of pickles tucked under her arm. He stood at the top of the steps, open-mouthed, unable to believe that his plan was falling apart, that he had committed a sin in his heart and broken the Sabbath for nothing. Gittel looked up just then and saw her husband standing at the top of the steps. In his eyes was a greed and desperation that had nothing to do with pickles. And as the veil of perception lifted and she saw her husband of 20 years for the first time as he truly was, she hesitated. It was her hesitation that caught her off balance, and that's when her foot slipped. I'm going to leave it there. We have time for another reading, Dora? Okay.
Yeah, I think you can read one more. And in the meantime, I'm just telling everyone that if you have questions, then you can put them in the chat and we will have Q&A afterwards. But you can read one more.
Okay, I'll read a little bit from the third story then. The Jonah. This is the one about the poor little Jewish girl, Tzili, who's taken into service by a wealthy Romanian Jewish couple who are horrible to her, as everyone in her life has been, except for her beloved Bubba. And this is when they get to the ship. The captain did not even deign to greet his passengers, despite the fact that they had paid exorbitant fees for their passage to the Holy Land. They were, after all, only Jews. He and his Bulgarian crew resented the trip, but after all, money was money, and they were making more from this 3-day voyage than they might otherwise make in months. So it was the officious bull ensign who greeted the passengers. The passengers had paid dearly for their tickets and were therefore utterly dismayed by their first glimpse of the ship. They had been assured of comfort, but there were paint flakes and patches of rust everywhere. The wooden lifeboats looked warped and barely seaworthy and hung listlessly above the deck. Like everyone else, Mr. and Mrs. Mogilescu were furious at the state of the ship, and in their impotence, there was no one to lash out at but the girl. Despite her Bubba's warmth and kindness, Celia had experienced enough cruelty from her teachers back when she'd still been allowed to attend school, and the poor Gentiles of Bilestu to recognize when it was coming her way. So she took pains not to utter so much as a grunt as she carried her mistress's bags to their private cabin. But when someone wants to find trouble, they will. Mrs. Mogilescu's eyes narrowed and she hissed, "Esti tirad veliza mea peteran mudare." She jerked her bag so hard out of Celi's hands that the girl stumbled. Celi knew she hadn't let her mistress's bag touch the deck, but she could do nothing but ignore the pinpoint of black fear that had taken root in her heart since she arrived in Bucharest and realized her days of childhood and freedom were over. She followed her master and mistress to their cabin, and now her mistress was truly becoming hysterical. The spacious, luxurious cabin they'd paid for was, in fact, cramped, dark, and moldy. Celi put away their bags and then took her own small satchel down to the hold, where the poorest passengers and the ship's cargo were piled on top of each other. Most of the area had already been claimed. Fortunately, she was little and only required a small section of floor. Celi put down the thin blanket she'd brought from home, her real home in Bilestu. not the home of her master and mistress, and made a thin, hard pallet. At night, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. At night, weary to the bone, Celie lay in the crowded hold. She found herself unable to sleep due to the variety of noises made by her fellow passengers. For a frightened girl all alone, the chorus of snores, mutterings, and the passage of wind was cacophonous. But soon exhaustion overtook her, and she began to drift off. Then Celie heard something strange, and her eyes flew open. Faintly, from somewhere at the other end of the hold, Celie heard something she'd never heard before, a kind of slithering and thumping. She sat up to look around her, but the other passengers hadn't seemed to notice. Perhaps she'd misheard. As Celia lay back down, her nostrils detected a whiff of something brackish, something made up of decomposition and dead water. So I think I'll stop there for some questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you for sharing the background and a bit of your book with us. And yes, if there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hands or put them in the chat. There was one question in the beginning that I will read. 1 second. Are there discussion questions in the book?
No, there are not. There aren't. This is this is a publisher out of Sweden named Onliansky Text, and he publishes in English and in Yiddish. So hopefully my talk here was answering a lot of the questions. But you know, if you have any questions after you read the book, you can certainly ask me. I will say it's half in English and half in Yiddish. So for the audio drama, I read the English, and a friend of mine, a wonderful Yiddish actress named Yelena Schmulenson, reads the Yiddish.
And can you say a bit about the significance of having the book also in English and in Yiddish, and how did you come up with that idea, and what is the significance of it?
Well, this publisher in particular publishes books in English and Yiddish, or purely Yiddish translations. This is a pretty informed crowd. If you heard about like the Harry Potter book in Yiddish, or the Tolkien books in Yiddish, this is this publisher who does this. So he's independent, and he's supported by the Swedish government, which, as I'm sure people here probably are aware, have some preserved languages that they support the husbandry of, one of which, you know, Sami, Romani, and I'm happy to say Yiddish. So there is, I guess, a very active, vital Yiddish scene there.
Thank you. Is the book in paperback?
The book's not going to be in paperback. It is in its second printing, but it's just hardcover, and it's the same price. It's you know, as I said, this is a small independent publisher, but also, you know, for this kind of material, I feel very fortunate that I have professional distribution, both musically and in literary terms. But this is not a story, unfortunately, that a lot of secular, let me see, or less specific publishers would understand or find of value. We are a small group.
Thank you. Sherry is asking if you can speak more of the history of women's voices being silenced. I think you did a very good overview, so I'm going to ask Sherry if there is anything specific that she would like to hear more of, or if you want to unmute, you can also ask your question with your voice. We allow people to open their mics.
Please use your voice.
And use their voices. So please, Sherry, feel free to to ask. And also I want to tell everyone that tomorrow we will send out the recording of this talk, and also the information where you can order the book. Okay, so how far back in time can you trace this, the silencing of women's voice?
Well, I guess it's a toss-up between ancient Jewish history in the King Solomon's time, or the interpretation in the 3rd century. But I think the farthest back I've traced it is ancient Greece and the funerary traditions, but also where our myths come from. And the Greek sirens are ancient Greek myth.
Thank you. So while we're waiting, I will ask also a few questions. I'm very curious if you've had any discussions with men who read the book, and like how they interpreted reading these stories, or if you got any interesting comment that you want to share with people here, that what they take out of it. Or
That is an interesting question. I am not sure. I mean, I guess it takes I would say, a particularly special man to see the word feminist and say, oh, I should read this. I will say that the first person I know who bought the book was a man, and all he told me was he could never look at pickles the same way. You'll get it. It's kind of the theme of the first one.
Thank you. Another question. This is from Myra. Do you know if women are still singing at funerals today in Greece or anywhere else where the practice may occur?
That's a very interesting question. I cannot answer with complete authority because I'm not a historian, but I will say that ancient Greek funerary practice was taken over by men. I think particularly when it became a profession. That's probably when you could trace it to, or when women became vital to the process. I imagine that the embrace of Christianity probably changed a lot of practices. And this was never a practice in the Greek Orthodox Church.
Thank you. So I will ask more while we wait for a few more questions. So now you spoke a lot about, of course, the aspect of the book, which is about the women's voice. But I think another thing that is very interesting in your book is how you paint the life in a shtetl, and how, in general, like not only for women, but in general, what this life is about, and how the characters are, and how the scenes are. So I think it would be very interesting to hear a little bit with your experience of researching about shtetls, or your own experience about Yiddishkeit, as you said, and shtetl life in general.
I thank you for that. I think the difference between art and historical research is historical research definitely deepens the artist's experience, but it's not something that deepens the audience's experience. So I was saying this to my husband the other day, in terms of creating art from the research that you do, which is the research is for the artist. It helps us to create and fashion these worlds based off of the verisimilitude of the research. For example, going back to the audio drama of The Witches of Lublin, which is still on audible.com, and it's set during Passover. We very specifically wanted to find a story that incorporated this shtetl specific history and culture with kind of creating this world of a woman's point of view. And there was research that, if you read Yale Strom's book of klezmer, you'll see this explored, because he really kind of goes from the fall of the Second Temple to today. Yes, thanks for the plug, Yale. But there were very rare but specific mentions in archives of women musicians, klezmorim, performing in marketplaces in the latter part of the 18th century, which is when we set our story. There was a Maria of Halberstadt, I believe, was a woman who was noted for playing in these public things. So to be honest, it was not only been unusual for a woman to be a musician playing for money, but certainly in that context, there would have been no singing. Again, because it might have been bad enough to be playing, but it wasn't using your voice. So yes, I mean, definitely every story is particularly, and I would say almost painstakingly researched, not just historically online, but I've been to all of these places. And I think that my own experience and definitely my travels, which I wanted to mention, my travels, but that has definitely helped me in describing these worlds and in creating these characters and even their physical settings.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question from Myra to her previous question. What about the wailing women you hear about in many cultures? Is that similar to this ancient funerary practice?
Yes, definitely. But now also there is, even today in certain more traditional, let's say, I don't want to just say orthodox, traditional settings, a group of women's voices is not as offensive, indecent as one woman's voice, because a group of women's voices becomes a wall of sound. It's not specific to one particular tempter. So definitely related, not just in Jewish culture, but in all of these cultures.
Thank you. I have another question. You mentioned this time when you sang in the Aldrich Street Synagogue, and that one woman reacting to you like that. But were there other reactions from the crowd? I know we always remember the one bad reaction out of many people, but how did overall the experience go, and what do you think the rest of the audience felt like? Or
I don't think the audience was there to enjoy a concert. I don't think that they were fully cognizant that this was a historical moment. I mean, it certainly weighed on me heavily, not in an oppressive way, but just like in a sense of this is momentous. Speaking specifically about the Eldridge Street, let me give you a little background to that. So when it began as a cultural venue, it was in the early 2000s. And our band, Yale Strom and Hapastrami, was asked to give a concert. And then the programmer called me to specifically apologize and said she hadn't been aware of the Kol Isha ban, and that unfortunately they couldn't extend the invitation to me because I would be singing. And I said, hey, no problem. And then I noticed that it was during some kind of an intermediary day that you could interpret as being more significant than other. And she had a band performing, male band, but during a time when some people might have said we shouldn't be playing music. So of course, being myself, I called her and I just said, oh, so I see that this is okay. So you know what, I'm going to come. I'll throw in my services for free. I won't sing. I'm just going to stand on the stage naked and play hand percussion. So she knew I was joking. And she said, you know what, instead of that idea, why don't I'm going to create a women only event. So she did. She created a women-only event so that I could sing, and only women were invited. And I don't think I need to point out what's the immediate thing that happens. You get about a quarter of the audience because, you know, you're not having any men coming. You're not having women who go with men coming. So, but I did that twice actually at Eldridge Street. And then we had moved out to California, and Papastrami was going to play a concert there. And she called me. By this time, she and I had become good friends and said, "Are you coming in?" And I said, "Well, are you asking me if I'm going to buy a plane ticket to come in and hear a band play that I hear all the time and sit in the audience? No, that's not really realistic. I appreciate it. I would love to see you, but that's not really realistic." And then she said, "I'm going to call you back." And about an hour later, she said, "I just met with the other programmers, and we have been trying to figure out a way to get rid of this ban." And this is how this whole invitation came about. And she said, "It should be interesting, and it's very frustrating to us that there is a synagogue board because it's a synagogue. Um, and the one person who has been preventing us from lifting this ban is an older woman." And I said, "Why? What? That is so fascinating to me. Why do we do that? Why are we doing that against ourselves?" And side note, majority of white women voted for Trump in 2016. But so why are we doing this why are we working against our own best interests? And she said, "Oh, her grandfather had been the rabbi at the synagogue." Yeah, it could have been the woman who shook her finger at me. In my mind, I equated the two. But she was there. I mean, that's kind of interesting that it would have been that woman and that she would have shown up for that concert. But it was certainly someone who knew about it and knew what was happening in that moment, because I didn't come out and say, "Hey, I'm breaking this ban. Whoopee!" You know, I was a bit more discreet, as I always would be in a professional context. But it's kind of interesting to see that the whole thing. I think it was. I'm reading these text things. I don't think it was that. It wasn't that she wasn't allowed to sing. I think for her it was about maintaining traditions, and I think that's for many of us. It's about maintaining traditions, even if those traditions no longer particularly seem relevant. And that's one of those things, as I describe it, among the many prohibitions in my religion. I always say that's always seems to be one of the a la carte items that are clung to when others are not. So I think it was just really about wanting to see that world continuing, even though she wasn't going to, be in this one forever. It was her way of kind of holding on to her family.
Thank you. Thank you for answering this. So now we are at the end of our time, and now I don't see more questions or comments coming. So you did stir up many thoughts, and I really recommend to everyone to read the book. It's really fascinating and very, very fast and amazingly good read. So I hope many of you will decide to get it and read it. So we will close for today. I will just pass back to some closing words to Elizabeth, and then we will say goodbye.
Well, this has just been wonderful. I'm really happy. Oh, thank you very much, Carol. I'm happy to meet you all via Zoom, and I hope to meet you one day in person. If you're in New York, November 23rd, we have a concert at B'nai Jeshurun on the Upper West Side. For those of you who are not in New York, I just want to mention Yale and I have been leading musical Jewish cultural tours for ayelet.com. And next year we'll be going to Lithuania and Greece. And these tours are very much about our doing music and about presenting concerts with local musicians. So if you have any questions or want to reach out, you can reach me on my website. And I look forward to hearing from you guys.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So we will share tomorrow with everyone also your website, so people will be able to learn about your activities and reach out to you. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you will have a wonderful rest of the day. And our next two events are going to be one is on Thursday about the Jews of Scandinavia. It will specifically focus on Sweden and Norway. So already we learned a little bit about Sweden today, that, for example, Yiddish is an official language in Sweden. And on Sunday, we will have a talk about Portugal. So we hope you can join us on some of these events and have a wonderful rest of the afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Sei gesund.